Hey guys, tonight we begin a story about two women who never met face to face, yet their rivalry defined an entire era. Imagine being born into royalty, only to discover that your own cousin, your blood, wants you dead. One would become the most powerful queen England ever knew. The other would lose her head on an executioner's block with her cousin's signature on the death warrant. They were family, they were queens, and they absolutely could not both survive. This is the story of Elizabeth and Mary, two baby girls born into a world that didn't want either of them, yet somehow they would fight over the same throne for nearly 30 years. So before we dive deep into this incredible true story, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring together. And hey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you tucked in bed in California? Sitting by a window in London? Maybe you're halfway across the globe where it's morning, not night. Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's travel back to the 1500s together. September 7th, 1533. Greenwich Palace, England. A baby girl is born, and almost immediately disappointment fills the room. King Henry VIII had been so certain this child would be a son. He'd already planned the celebrations, the tournaments, the grand announcements. But instead, he got Elizabeth, a daughter, the wrong gender entirely. Henry barely acknowledged her. See, this wasn't just any baby. This was Anne Boleyn's child, and Anne had promised Henry a son. That was the whole reason he'd broken with the Catholic Church, divorced his first wife, and turned England upside down. All for a son. And now, a girl. But here's where it gets darker. Little Elizabeth was only 2 years and 8 months old when her mother, Anne Boleyn, was arrested, accused of treason and adultery and executed. Beheaded. Can you imagine? One day you have a mother, the next day she's gone, and nobody will speak her name again. Elizabeth would grow up never really knowing if her mother was guilty or innocent, never getting to grieve properly, because in the Tudor court showing emotion was showing weakness, and weakness could get you killed. Now, fast forward 9 years, December 8th, 1542. Linlithgow Palace, Scotland. Another baby girl enters the world, but this time the circumstances are completely different. This baby is Mary Stuart, and unlike Elizabeth, she's wanted, she's treasured. But here's the tragic twist. Her father, King James V of Scotland, dies when Mary is just 6 days old. 6 days. She hadn't even properly opened her eyes yet, and suddenly she's Queen of Scotland. A queen in diapers. A monarch who can't even hold her own head up yet. 2 baby girls. 2 queens. Born 9 years apart into 2 completely different worlds, but connected by one crucial detail: their cousins, family, and that family connection. That's what would eventually destroy one of them. Let's talk about their childhoods, because honestly, it's like comparing fire and ice. Elizabeth grew up in what I can only describe as a masterclass in survival. After her mother's execution, she was declared illegitimate, basically stripped of her princess title. She went from being second in line to the throne to being nobody, just the king's daughter. The unwanted one. She was shuffled between different households, never quite sure where she stood, watching her father marry 4 more times, 4 more wives after her mother, and some of them, they were nice to her, like Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, who was actually kind to young Elizabeth. But then Elizabeth had to watch Catherine get arrested and executed too, when she was just 9 years old. Another woman she cared about, gone, beheaded. Do you see the pattern here? Elizabeth was learning a brutal lesson. Attachment is dangerous. Love makes you vulnerable. Trust can get you killed. At 9 years old, according to historical accounts, Elizabeth reportedly vowed she would never marry. Think about that. 9 years old, and she's already building walls around her heart that would last her entire life. Meanwhile, across the sea in France, little Mary Stuart was living a completely different story. At 5 years old, she was sent to the French court, and let me tell you, this was like sending a child to live in a fairy tale castle. The French royal court was the most sophisticated, glamorous, cultured place in all of Europe. Mary was betrothed to the French prince, Francis, a political alliance, sure, but they were children growing up together. She was educated in music, dance, poetry, languages. She learned to be charming, graceful, everything a queen should be. She wore beautiful gowns, attended glittering parties, was adored by everyone. She was the favorite, the special one. While Elizabeth was learning to hide her emotions and watch her back, Mary was learning to shine, to trust, to believe in romance and chivalry and happy endings. One girl was being trained for survival in a snake pit. The other was being prepared for a life of luxury and admiration. And here's the psychological insight that I find absolutely fascinating. Both of these childhoods were setting these women up for their futures and ultimately for their collision. Elizabeth's traumatic childhood taught her to be calculating, suspicious, strategic. She learned to play the long game. She understood that in politics you show people what they want to see, not what you actually feel. She became a master manipulator, and I mean that in the best possible way. She had to be. It kept her alive. But Mary's privileged, protected childhood taught her something completely different. It taught her that she deserved love, that people would help her, that her royal status would protect her. She learned to trust her heart, to believe in loyalty, to think that being legitimate and royal was enough. She never developed Elizabeth's armor. She never learned to hide. Now let's talk about the family tree that connects them, because this is crucial to understanding everything that comes next. Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, had an older sister named Margaret Tudor. Margaret married King James IV of Scotland, and their son was James Vester, Mary's father. So if you're following the bloodline, Mary was Henry VIII's great niece. She was Elizabeth's cousin once removed, but here's the really important part. In the eyes of many Catholics across Europe, Mary actually had a stronger claim to the English throne than Elizabeth. Why? Because Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was Henry's second wife. But the Catholic Church never recognized Henry's divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So in Catholic eyes, Henry and Anne's marriage was invalid, which meant Elizabeth was illegitimate, a bastard, not a true heir. But Mary's lineage was unquestioned, solid, legitimate. She was descended from Henry VIII's older sister, and in those days legitimacy was everything. Your bloodline was your power. Your birth certificate was basically your resume for ruling a country. So here we have Elizabeth, brilliant, strategic, tough as nails from years of survival training, but technically illegitimate. And Mary, beautiful, charming, beloved, with an unquestionable royal bloodline, but naive about the brutal reality of power politics. Both queens. Both young women trying to navigate a world that fundamentally didn't believe women should rule at all. There was this Scottish preacher named John Knox who literally wrote a book called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Monstrous regiment, meaning rule, of women. He said it was against God's will for women to have authority over men, that a woman ruling was a monster in nature. Both Elizabeth and Mary had to fight against this attitude every single day, but they fought in completely opposite ways. Elizabeth fought by becoming more ruthless than the men around her, by never marrying, never giving any man power over her, by being so sharp, so clever, so politically brilliant that they couldn't deny her capability. She weaponized her femininity, playing up the Virgin Queen image while ruling with an iron fist. Mary fought by trying to prove she could be both a queen and a traditional woman. She married, multiple times actually. She believed in love, in partnership, in the idea that the right man could help her rule. She wanted to have it all: power and romance, crown and family, and spoiler alert, this approach would ultimately destroy her. But in their childhoods, neither of them knew this yet. Elizabeth was just trying to survive each day without ending up like her mother. Mary was just a little girl being doted on in the French court, completely unaware that back in England there was another little girl, her cousin, who was learning lessons that would one day make her the most formidable queen Europe had ever seen. And here's what keeps me up at night thinking about this story. What if their childhoods had been reversed? What if Elizabeth had been the one raised in luxury and love? What if Mary had been the one forced to survive in a dangerous court? Would their fates have been different? Would the survivor have become the romantic and the romantic have become the survivor? Because at the end of the day, they were both just little girls who didn't ask to be born into this impossible situation. Neither of them chose to be queens. Neither of them wanted to be enemies, but history, family, religion, and the brutal politics of the 16th century would force them into roles they never auditioned for. Two baby queens. One would die old and powerful, the Virgin Queen, arguably one of the greatest monarchs in English history. The other would die at 44 on her knees under an executioner's axe, a tragic figure who bet on love and lost everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, they're still children. Elizabeth is learning Latin and Greek, teaching herself to trust no one. Mary is learning to dance and charm, believing the world is fundamentally good. Neither of them knows that in just a few years, their paths will collide in a rivalry so intense, so personal, so devastating, that it would captivate Europe for decades and echo through history for centuries. But before they could become enemies, they first had to become queens, and the education they received, formal and informal, intentional and accidental, would determine not just how they ruled, but how they fought. One learned to survive, one learned to shine, and in the brutal world of 16th century politics, only one of those skills would be enough. So here's where we'll pick up next: the education of queens. How do you prepare a woman to rule in a world that believes women shouldn't rule at all? Elizabeth and Mary found two very different answers to that question, and those answers would set the stage for everything that follows: the letters, the plots, the betrayals, and ultimately that cold February morning when one cousin would sign the death warrant for another. Stay with me. This story is just beginning, and trust me, you won't believe where it goes next. So, we've established that these two little girls had wildly different childhoods. But childhood is one thing, education is something else entirely. And in the 16th century, how you were educated determined not just what you knew, but whether you survived. For Elizabeth and Mary, their education became their weapons. One would wield knowledge like a sword, the other would wield charm like a shield. And spoiler alert, in the brutal Game of Thrones they were about to play, only one of those weapons would be sharp enough. Let me tell you something that absolutely blows my mind. Elizabeth Tudor could speak 6 languages fluently by the time she was 16. 6. We're talking English, Latin, Greek, French, Italian and Spanish. At 16 I could barely handle Spanish class, and she's over here having philosophical debates in ancient Greek. But here's the thing, This wasn't just about being impressive at dinner parties. For Elizabeth, languages were survival tools. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, later wrote about her. Her mind has no womanly weakness. Her perseverance is equal to that of a man. Now, that sounds sexist as hell to our modern ears, right? But in the 1550s, that was literally the highest compliment you could give a woman. Ascham was saying, she thinks like a man. She's smart enough to actually matter. And Elizabeth knew this was her ticket to relevance. She couldn't inherit the throne on beauty alone. She'd been declared illegitimate, remember? She needed to prove she was more capable than any man who might challenge her. So young, Elizabeth studied. Like, obsessively. While other noble girls were learning needlework and how to run a household, Elizabeth was translating works by ancient philosophers. She'd wake up at dawn and study until her candles burned out at night. Latin grammar, Greek poetry, theology, history, political philosophy. She was building an armour made of intelligence, because she'd learned something crucial from watching her father's court. In a world where men hold all the power, the only way for a woman to survive is to be smarter than every single one of them. And here's a specific example that shows her genius. When she was just 13, Elizabeth translated an entire religious text, Marguerite of Navarre's Mirror of the Sinful Soul, from French into English as a New Year's gift for her stepmother, Catherine Parr. A 13-year-old, translating complex theological arguments, producing a bound manuscript in her own handwriting. But it wasn't just showing off, it was strategic. She was demonstrating to the adults around her, I'm valuable, I'm educated, I'm worth keeping alive. Every letter she wrote, every conversation she had was calculated. She learned to speak in riddles when she needed to say yes while meaning no, to promise everything while committing to nothing. She studied her father's reign and learned what worked, and more importantly, what got people killed. She became a master of what we'd call today reading the room. She could walk into a court full of men who wanted her dead and walk out with them eating from her hand. That's not luck, that's education weaponized. Now flip over to Mary in France. Different continent, different curriculum, completely different vibe. Mary Stuart was being educated too, but for a totally different purpose. She was learning to be the perfect Renaissance queen, which in the 16th century meant beautiful, cultured, graceful, and charming. And oh boy, did she excel at this. Mary learned to play the lute beautifully. She could dance better than almost anyone at the French court. She spoke French as fluently as her native Scots. Actually, probably better, since she barely remembered Scotland. She could write poetry. She understood fashion. She knew exactly which compliment to give to which ambassador. She was trained in falconry, which was basically the golf of medieval nobility. She learned the art of conversation, how to make powerful men feel important, how to laugh at their jokes, how to be memorable in all the right ways. And this wasn't shallow stuff, by the way. Don't mistake charm for stupidity. Mary was genuinely intelligent. She could converse about literature, music, art. But here's the crucial difference. Elizabeth was educated to outthink men. Mary was educated to attract them. Elizabeth learned strategy and manipulation. Mary learned grace and persuasion. One was trained to be a player in the Game of Thrones. The other was trained to be the prize. Can you see the problem brewing here? Have you ever been taught skills for one situation, only to find yourself in a completely different one? That's what happened to Mary. She was prepared for the French court, where queens were supposed to be beautiful ornaments who occasionally gave good advice. But she was going to end up ruling Scotland, a rough, violent, religiously divided country where survival required ruthlessness, not poetry. It's like being trained for a ballet performance and then being thrown into a cage match. You might be technically skilled, but you're absolutely in the wrong arena. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the angry Scottish preacher screaming about monstrous women, John Knox. This guy deserves his own villain origin story. Knox was a Protestant reformer in Scotland, and he genuinely, truly, deeply believed that women ruling nations was against God's divine plan. In 1558, he published that book I mentioned earlier, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Here's an actual quote from it. "To promote a woman to bear rule, superiority, dominion, or empire above any realm, nation, or city is repugnant to nature, contumely to God, and a thing most contrarious to his revealed will and approved ordinance." Translation: women ruling anything is unnatural, insulting to God, and just plain wrong. He literally argued that women were too weak, too emotional, too irrational to govern. And this wasn't some fringe opinion. This was mainstream thinking. Most educated men in Europe believed this. They'd quote Aristotle, they'd quote the Bible, they'd build entire philosophical arguments about why women's bodies and minds made them unfit for leadership. Women were seen as fundamentally unstable, ruled by their wombs, if you can believe the medical theories of the time, too hysterical to make rational decisions, too gentle to wage war, too emotional to execute traitors. Both Elizabeth and Mary had to rule in the shadow of this belief, but they handled it in completely opposite ways, and this is where their education really shows. Elizabeth's strategy was basically, fine, you think women are weak? Watch me be stronger than any king you've ever seen. She played into the Virgin Queen image, pure, devoted only to England, married to her country. But behind that image, she was absolutely ruthless. She learned to execute her enemies without flinching. She learned to play foreign powers against each other. She learned to use her femininity as a weapon, flirting with ambassadors to get what she wanted, but never actually giving them power over her. There's this famous speech she gave to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, when the Spanish Armada was approaching. She said, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Brilliant, right? She acknowledges what they believe about women, but then flips it. Yes, I'm a woman, but I'm more courageous than any man. She beat them at their own game by playing by their rules while secretly breaking every single one. Mary's approach was different. She tried to prove that a woman could be both feminine and powerful, that you didn't have to choose between being a queen and being a woman. She married, 3 times actually, because she believed that's what queens did. They married powerful men, they had heirs, they ruled together as partnerships. She tried to be what a Renaissance queen was supposed to be. Beautiful, pious, maternal, but also strong and legitimate. And you know what? In a fair world, her approach might have worked. But the world wasn't fair. Every time Mary showed emotion, it was used against her. When she cried, and she had plenty to cry about, as we'll see, it was proof that women were too emotional to rule. When she fell in love, it was proof that women were ruled by passion rather than reason. Elizabeth could afford to be cold and calculating because she deliberately removed herself from the traditional female role. Mary couldn't because she was trying to be both. Let me give you a concrete example of how their different educations played out. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her first challenges was dealing with Parliament, which was full of men demanding she marry and produce an heir. They genuinely believed England needed a king, and Elizabeth was just a temporary placeholder until she could marry one. Here's what Elizabeth did. She gave a speech where she held up her coronation ring and said, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England. Mic drop. She used romantic language, the language of marriage that these men understood, but she weaponized it. She made herself untouchable by claiming to already be married to England. Mary, when faced with similar pressure to marry, actually did it, multiple times, and not just political marriages. She fell in love. She chose with her heart, and every single time it was a disaster. We'll get into those disasters later, but here's the point. Elizabeth was educated to see marriage as a political tool. Mary was educated to see it as a duty and possibly a source of happiness. Same pressure, completely different responses based on completely different educations. Now here's something I find fascinating. Both women wrote letters to each other, and if you read them, and yes, many of these letters still exist, you can see their educational differences in action. Elizabeth's letters are masterpieces of diplomatic double-speak. She'd write things like, "Dear Sister Queen, though we grieve to hear of your troubles, we must counsel caution and virtue above all else." Sounds supportive, right? But actually she's saying nothing. She's expressing sympathy without promising help. She's giving advice without taking sides. It's brilliant and infuriating at the same time. Mary's letters, on the other hand, are emotional and direct. When her second husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered under suspicious circumstances, she wrote to Elizabeth, "I am so upset I can neither write nor think." She's raw, she's honest, she's asking for understanding. And Elizabeth read that and probably thought, amateur move, never show weakness. Because Elizabeth had learned that vulnerability is dangerous. Mary had learned that vulnerability creates connection. Who was right? Well, that's the tragic question, isn't it? In a better world, Mary's approach, honest, emotional, human, would be valued. But in the brutal political landscape of the 16th century, Elizabeth's armour of intellect and strategic thinking was what kept you alive. Here's the common mistake people make when they look at these two queens. They assume Elizabeth was smart and Mary was stupid. That's not true at all. Mary was intelligent, educated, cultured, but she was educated for the wrong war. She brought a violin to a knife fight. She was trained to win hearts, but she needed to break them. She was taught that being a good queen meant being beloved. Elizabeth learned that being a powerful queen meant being feared, and both of them, every single day, had to deal with men like John Knox telling them they had no right to exist as rulers at all. Can you imagine that level of pressure? Waking up every day knowing that half of Europe thinks you're an abomination against nature just because of your gender? Both women internalized that pressure, but it pushed them in opposite directions. Elizabeth became more masculine in her rulership, strategic, unemotional, dominant. Mary tried to prove femininity and power weren't contradictory. Caring, emotional, collaborative. The lesson here isn't that one approach was right and the other was wrong. The lesson is that the same challenge can produce radically different solutions depending on how you're prepared for it. Elizabeth's harsh childhood prepared her for a harsh reign. Mary's sheltered childhood left her vulnerable to harsh realities. Neither of them asked for this. Neither of them wanted to be enemies. But their education set them on collision courses they couldn't avoid. Because here's what's coming next, 1558. The year that changes everything. The year Elizabeth becomes Queen of England. The year Mary, already Queen of Scotland, marries the French prince and becomes Queen of France too. The year their rivalry stops being theoretical and becomes deadly real. Because in 1558, Mary makes one decision, one bold political claim that Elizabeth will never ever forgive. Two queens, educated in completely different ways, are about to come face to face with their destiny. One has learned to be a fox, the other has learned to be a peacock, and the game they're about to play, it requires foxes. Let's see what happens when Mary's beauty and Elizabeth's brilliance finally collide. Picture this. November the 17th, 1558. A cold, grey morning in England. Queen Mary, thus, yes, there was another Mary before our Mary. This one's Elizabeth's half-sister. Dies at the age of 42, probably from ovarian cancer, though they didn't know that then. The moment she takes her last breath, everything changes. 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor, the girl who'd spent her entire life one wrong move away from the executioner's block, is suddenly Queen of England. And across the English Channel in France, 16-year-old Mary Stuart hears this news and thinks, wait, that throne should be mine. Now before you pick sides here, let me tell you why 1558 wasn't just another year. It was the year that turned two cousins into mortal enemies. Because what happened next wasn't just political manoeuvring, it was personal. It was a wound that would never heal. And it all started with something that sounds almost ridiculous to us now. A coat of arms. When Elizabeth becomes queen, she doesn't waste time. She's got this coronation planned, she's assembling her council, she's making it crystal clear, I am the legitimate Queen of England, chosen by God, recognised by Parliament, and if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with my executioners. She's 25 years old, but she's not playing around. This is the moment she's been preparing for her entire life. Every language she learned, every political lesson she absorbed, every time she bit her tongue and survived, it was all for this. But here's where it gets messy. Mary Stuart is also having a pretty spectacular year. She's already Queen of Scotland, right? Has been since she was 6 days old. And in April 1558, 7 months before Elizabeth becomes Queen, Mary marries Francis, the Dauphin of France, the heir to the French throne. So she's not just Queen of Scotland anymore. She's about to be Queen of France too. That's 2 countries, 2 crowns. Pretty impressive for a 16-year-old. But Mary's father-in-law, King Henri II of France, decides 2 crowns aren't enough. He looks at the situation and thinks, you know what? My daughter-in-law has a better claim to England than Elizabeth does. Let's just declare her Queen of England too. And that's exactly what he does. The moment Elizabeth's half-sister Mary dies, before Elizabeth is even coronated, Henri II proclaims his son Francis and daughter-in-law Mary as King and Queen of England, Ireland, and France. Now, did they actually control England? No. Was Elizabeth literally sitting on the throne in London? Yes. But in Henri's mind, and in the minds of Catholic Europe, this was legitimate. Because remember, the Catholic Church never recognised Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. In their eyes, Elizabeth was illegitimate, a bastard. And Mary, with her perfect Tudor bloodline through Henry VIII's older sister Margaret, was the rightful heir. Here's where the heraldry comes in, and I know what you're thinking. Who cares about fancy family crests? But trust me, in the 16th century, heraldry was everything. It was like your Instagram verification check, your LinkedIn profile, and your birth certificate all rolled into one. The symbols on your coat of arms announced to the world exactly who you were and what you claimed to own. Mary starts displaying the royal arms of England, the 3 gold lions on a red background, quartered with the arms of Scotland and France. She's literally announcing to all of Europe, I am Queen of Scotland, France, and England. Her dishes had these arms engraved on them, her furniture, her official seals. Everywhere you looked, there was Mary Stuart claiming Elizabeth's throne, and not quietly, not subtly, loudly and publicly, with all the ceremony and symbolism that European royalty could muster. Can you imagine how Elizabeth felt? You've finally made it. You've survived everything. Your mother's execution, your sister's persecution. Years of walking a tightrope between life and death, you're finally queen, and your 16-year-old cousin, safe in her French palace, is telling everyone who'll listen that actually, no, she's the real Queen of England. You're just the illegitimate placeholder. If someone did that to you, if a family member publicly claimed that your job, your position, your entire identity was rightfully theirs, how would you feel? Would you ever forgive them? Would you ever trust them? This is the moment Elizabeth's feelings toward Mary hardened into something that would never soften. But here's the fascinating complexity. Mary's claim wasn't crazy. Legally, from a Catholic perspective, she actually did have a stronger claim. Henry VIII's older sister Margaret married the King of Scotland. Mary was their great-granddaughter. In terms of pure bloodline, not considering Henry VIII's declaration that Elizabeth was his heir, Mary's claim was arguably superior. She was unquestionably legitimate. Her parents' marriage was recognised by everyone. Her royal blood was undiluted. Elizabeth's claim was based on her father's will and the English Parliament's decision. But her mother's marriage, controversial. Her legitimacy, questionable, depending on who you asked. So in a purely legalistic blood rights sense, Mary had a case. But politics isn't about what's legal or right. It's about what's possible. And what was possible was that Elizabeth was sitting in London with an army, a treasury, and the support of Protestant England. Mary was in France with a theoretical claim and no way to enforce it. Elizabeth had possession, Mary had a pedigree, and in the brutal reality of 16th century power politics, possession beats pedigree every single time. Here's the strategic mistake that Henri II made, and that young Mary went along with. He picked a fight with a woman who'd spent her entire life learning how to win fights. Elizabeth wasn't some pampered princess who'd buckle under pressure. She was a survivor who turned survival into an art form. When Henri II declared Mary the Queen of England, he didn't intimidate Elizabeth. He made her an enemy. He gave her a target. And Elizabeth was very, very good at eliminating targets. The letters between them start around this time, and they're absolutely fascinating. They call each other Sister Queen and Dear Cousin, but underneath the courtly language there's this tension you could cut with a knife. Elizabeth writes to Mary in this very measured diplomatic way. We understand that you have recently displayed certain arms which belong to us. We trust this was an oversight and will be corrected. So polite, so calm. But the subtext is, stop claiming my throne or there will be consequences. Mary writes back with this mix of deference and defiance. She essentially says, my dear father-in-law, the King of France, made this decision, and I, as an obedient daughter, cannot question him. She's passing the buck, hiding behind her father-in-law's authority. But she's also not taking the arms down. The English lions stay quartered with Scotland and France. The claim remains, and this is where their different educations really matter. Elizabeth sees this as a chess move that requires a counter-move. Mary sees it as, what? Family politics, courtly ceremony, something she can smooth over with kind words and sisterly affection. She doesn't seem to grasp that she's made an enemy for life. Or maybe she does grasp it, but her position in France is too comfortable to risk offending her father-in-law by backing down. There's this tragic quality to watching it unfold, because you want to grab Mary and shake her and say, do you not understand what you've done? This woman will never forgive you. Never. She'll be pleasant to your face, but she's marking you as a threat, and Elizabeth eliminates threats. But Mary is 16, surrounded by powerful men telling her what to do, and probably genuinely believes that this is just how royal politics works. You make claims, you negotiate, you write polite letters, and eventually everyone figures it out. But Elizabeth isn't playing that game. Elizabeth is playing the long game, the survival game, the game where you smile at your enemies while plotting their destruction, and from 1558 onward, Mary is her enemy. Now, July 1559. Mary's situation gets even better, from her perspective anyway. King Henry II dies in a jousting accident. A splinter from a lance goes through his eye and into his brain. It's a gruesome, random death. And suddenly, Mary's 15-year-old husband Francis becomes King Francis II of France. Mary is now Queen of France, in fact, not just in title. At 16 years old, she's Queen of Scotland and Queen of France, two of the most powerful countries in Europe. Only Spain and England rival her combined power. From Paris, this looks amazing for Mary. She's at the absolute pinnacle of royal success. But from London, this looks terrifying to Elizabeth. Her rival, the woman claiming her throne, now controls France. France, England's traditional enemy. This is nightmare fuel for Elizabeth, because if France decides to back Mary's claim with military force, England could actually be invaded. Mary's theoretical claim could become a real threat. But then, and history is full of these cruel twists, Francis II dies, December the 5th, 1560, just 18 months after becoming king. He was sickly his whole life, probably had an ear infection that spread to his brain. Mary is 18 years old, and suddenly she's a widow, no longer Queen of France. Her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, makes it very clear that Mary is no longer welcome to stay in France. She needs to leave, go back to Scotland, that rough country she barely remembers. And here's the thing, when Francis dies, Mary could have done something incredibly smart. She could have written to Elizabeth and said, "Look, that whole claiming your throne thing, that was my father-in-law's idea. I was 16. I'm sorry. Can we start over?" A genuine apology, a real olive branch, might have changed everything. Elizabeth was practical. If Mary had renounced her claim to England, acknowledged Elizabeth as the rightful queen, they might have actually become allies. At minimum, Elizabeth might have helped Mary when she needed it. But Mary doesn't do that. Whether it's pride or bad advice or genuine belief in her superior claim, she never apologizes. She never backs down. The English arms stay in her heraldry. The claim remains, even if quietly. And when she's forced to return to Scotland in 1561, that unresolved tension travels with her. This is the mistake that neither of them could fix. It's the original sin of their relationship. Mary claimed something that wasn't hers to claim. Or was it? Depends on your perspective. Elizabeth refused to forgive an insult to her legitimacy. Or was it a genuine threat? Again, depends on your perspective. Two women, two valid viewpoints, zero room for compromise. Have you ever had a relationship where one moment, one decision, one sentence poisoned everything that came after? Where no matter how much time passes, you can never quite get past that initial hurt? That's what 1558 did to Elizabeth and Mary. It set a pattern that would repeat for 3 decades. Mary doing things that seemed reasonable to her, Elizabeth seeing them as threats, neither woman able to bridge the gap because the foundation was cracked from the start. And the cruelest irony, they never met, not once. For 30 years they're going to write letters, send ambassadors, negotiate, threaten, and ultimately destroy each other. And they never once stood in the same room. All of this drama, all of this tragedy, between two women who knew each other only through letters and rumours and political machinations. So now it's 1561. Elizabeth is the established Queen of England 3 years into her reign, growing more confident and more powerful every day. Mary is returning to Scotland, a country she barely knows, speaking a language she's rusty in, trying to rule Protestant lords while she's Catholic with no husband and no clear path forward. Both queens, both unmarried, both facing pressure to produce heirs, both knowing that somewhere across the border their cousin sits on a throne, nursing a grudge that will never die. This stage is set. The battle lines are drawn. And what comes next is going to be one of the most fascinating contrasts in history. How two queens, faced with the exact same problem, the exact same pressure, the exact same question, chose completely opposite answers. The question was simple: should a queen marry? Elizabeth's answer would shock Europe. Mary's answer would destroy her. Let's talk about love, power, and the catastrophic difference between them. There's this question that haunted both Elizabeth and Mary from the moment they became queens. Who will you marry? Not if, who. Because in the 16th century, the idea of an unmarried queen was almost unthinkable. Queens were supposed to marry kings or powerful nobles, produce heirs, and let their husbands handle the messy business of actually ruling. A woman ruling alone? That was temporary at best, dangerous at worst. Parliament, advisors, foreign ambassadors, everyone expected both women to marry quickly and appropriately. But here's where these two cousins diverge so dramatically that their choices would literally determine whether they lived or died. Elizabeth turned marriage into the most brilliant political weapon of her entire reign. Mary turned it into her greatest vulnerability. Same pressure, same question. Two answers that couldn't have been more different. And honestly, both strategies made perfect sense, until only one of them worked. Let's start with Elizabeth, because her approach was genius-level manipulation. From the moment she becomes queen, the marriage proposals start flooding in. King Philip II of Spain, her dead half-sister's widower, which, awkward, proposes. Multiple French princes are interested. Swedish royalty sends emissaries. Every eligible nobleman in Europe sees an opportunity, and Elizabeth says yes to all of them. Well, not yes exactly. More like, maybe, let's talk about it. I'm very interested. Send more ambassadors. She strings them along. For years. Decades, actually. She'd flirt with Spanish ambassadors while secretly negotiating with the French. She'd act like she was seriously considering marriage to one prince while entertaining proposals from another. And the brilliant part? Each suitor thought he had a real chance. Each country stayed friendly with England because they believed their prince might become King of England. Elizabeth kept everyone guessing, everyone hoping, everyone invested in keeping her alive and in power. There's this famous moment in 1563 when Parliament basically begs her to marry. They're terrified because she'd been seriously ill with smallpox, she nearly died, and England has no heir. If Elizabeth dies unmarried with no children, the succession crisis could tear the country apart. So Parliament sends a delegation, and Elizabeth gives them this incredible response. She tells them she's perfectly content to live and die a virgin, and if that happens, she wants her tombstone to say, "Here lies Elizabeth, who lived and died a virgin." Now, was she actually a virgin? That's been debated for 450 years. Did she have secret relationships? Maybe. There are theories about Robert Dudley, her favourite courtier, the man she genuinely seemed to love. But here's what matters. She controlled the narrative. The Virgin Queen, married to England. She made her unmarried status part of her mystique, her power, her brand. She turned what should have been a weakness, no husband, no male protector, into her greatest strength. Because here's what Elizabeth understood that Mary didn't. The moment you marry, you give someone else power over you. In the 16th century, when a woman married, Legally, everything she owned became her husband's property. Her money, her lands, her decisions, all transferred to her husband. Now imagine that on a national scale. If Elizabeth marries, does her husband become king? Does he get to make decisions about English policy? Does he control the army, the treasury? Where does the Queen's power end and the King's power begin? Elizabeth looked at that situation and said, "Absolutely not. I'll flirt with the entire continent before I let anyone take my power away." And it worked. By staying unmarried, she kept absolute control. No man could claim authority over her. No foreign power could control England through a royal marriage. She was the sole ruler, answerable to no one, and she maintained that position for 45 years. But this came at a cost. The personal cost. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was the love of her life, or at least as close as Elizabeth allowed herself to get to love. They'd known each other since childhood. He was handsome, charming, intelligent, and genuinely devoted to her. The chemistry between them was obvious to everyone at court. Ambassadors wrote reports about how much time they spent together, how she'd touch his hand, how they danced together, and Elizabeth couldn't marry him. First, because he was already married, though his wife died under very suspicious circumstances in 1560, falling downstairs and breaking her neck. Some people thought Dudley murdered her to free himself for Elizabeth. Second, even if he was free, marrying her favourite courtier wouldn't bring any political advantage. No foreign alliance, no military support, no strategic benefit. It would just be love. And Elizabeth had learned that love was a luxury queens couldn't afford, so she kept him close but unmarried. For decades. He eventually married someone else. She was reportedly furious, but what could she say? She'd refused him. He waited years for her. At some point, he needed an heir. The tragedy of Elizabeth's choice is that she got power, security, and independence, but she gave up intimacy, family, and the possibility of personal happiness. Now, flip the coin. Mary's approach was completely opposite. When Mary returns to Scotland in 1561, she's 19 years old, widowed, and everyone's telling her the same thing. Marry again. Soon. Scotland needs a king. You need an heir. But Mary adds something Elizabeth never would. She wants love. She actually believes she can have both, political stability and romantic happiness. She believes in fairy tales. At first, she plays it smart. She asks Elizabeth's advice about potential husbands. She writes these letters saying essentially, "Dear cousin, who should I marry? I want to please you." And Elizabeth, in classic Elizabeth fashion, suggests Robert Dudley, her own favourite. The man she's been flirting with for years. She offers to send him to Scotland to marry Mary. Can you see what she's doing? It's brilliant and cruel at the same time. If Mary marries Dudley, Elizabeth gets a spy in the Scottish court, someone loyal to her, reporting back, potentially controlling Mary. If Mary refuses, Elizabeth can claim Mary was unreasonable, ungrateful. It's a win-win for Elizabeth. And Mary, bless her heart, actually considers it. She's trying so hard to please her cousin, to mend the relationship damaged by that heraldry scandal. But then Mary meets Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and everything goes sideways. Darnley arrives in Scotland in early 1565, and Mary falls hard. And I mean hard. Darnley was tall, over 6 feet, which was rare then. Blonde, handsome, charming when he wanted to be. He could dance, play music, write poetry. He was also English nobility with his own claim to the English throne through Margaret Tudor. On paper, he seemed perfect. A British match that united Scottish and English interests. Plus, Mary was genuinely attracted to him. They married on July 29, 1565, and Elizabeth was absolutely furious. Mary had married without her permission, which technically Mary needed as Elizabeth's subject if she wanted to maintain her place in the English succession. But more than that, Mary had married someone with a claim to Elizabeth's throne. Two people with Tudor blood, united. If they had children, those children would have an even stronger claim to England. Elizabeth saw this as a direct threat, and she wasn't wrong. But here's where Mary's romantic strategy starts to crumble. Darnley was handsome, sure, but he was also vain, immature, jealous, and increasingly violent. Within months of the wedding, Mary realizes she's made a terrible mistake. Darnley wants to be called king, not just the Queen's consort. He wants power. He wants to make decisions. And when Mary, who actually knows how to rule, refuses to give him authority he hasn't earned, he turns nasty. Enter David Rizzio. Rizzio was Mary's Italian secretary, a talented musician, someone she trusted completely. They'd stay up late working on correspondence, discussing politics, playing music. Completely platonic by all accounts. But Darnley became convinced they were having an affair. The pregnant queen and her Italian secretary. And Darnley's jealousy, combined with political scheming from Scottish Protestant lords who hated Mary's Catholic policies, created a powder keg. March 9th, 1566. Holyrood Palace, Edinburgh. Mary is 6 months pregnant. She's having dinner in her private chambers with Rizzio and a few friends. It's evening, intimate, relaxed. And suddenly, Darnley bursts in with a group of armed conspirators. They grab Rizzio. He's screaming, pleading, clutching at Mary's skirts for protection. Mary is begging them to stop, commanding them as queen to let him go. But Darnley holds her back, his own pregnant wife, while the men drag Rizzio out of the room and stab him. 80 times, 80 stab wounds. They murder him right outside her chamber, making sure she can hear every moment of it. Can you imagine the trauma? Mary is 6 months pregnant, held back by her own husband, while men murder her friend in the next room. The psychological impact of that moment, it's almost unthinkable. And this is what happened when Mary chose love over strategy, romance over calculation. She married a man who seemed perfect but turned out to be a monster. Elizabeth hears about this and writes Mary a letter. On the surface, it's sympathetic. Dear Sister Queen, we are shocked and grieved by your troubles. But underneath, there's probably a part of Elizabeth thinking, this is why you don't marry for love. This is why you keep control. This is what happens when you let a man into your bed and your throne room. And here's the heartbreaking contrast. On the same night that Mary is being traumatized by her husband's violence, Elizabeth is in London, unmarried, unattached, absolutely in control, hosting ambassadors and playing diplomatic games. One queen chose safety and power, the other chose love and partnership. One queen sleeps alone but rules alone. The other has a husband who just proved he's willing to terrorize her. The question isn't which choice was right. The question is which choice let you survive. And in the brutal world of 16th century politics, Elizabeth's cold calculation was proving far more effective than Mary's warm heart. Mary had wanted what seemed natural: love, family, partnership. Elizabeth wanted what seemed impossible: absolute power with no strings attached. But Mary's natural choice was destroying her, while Elizabeth's impossible choice was making her legendary. Both strategies came with costs. Elizabeth gave up the possibility of personal intimacy for political survival. Mary risked political survival for personal intimacy. Neither woman should have had to make that choice, but they did, and only one of them would live long enough to die of old age. But we're not done with Lord Darnley yet. The Rizzio murder was just the beginning of Mary's nightmare. Because what happens next, the explosion, the mystery, the scandal, would turn Mary from a queen into a suspect, from a ruler into a prisoner, and set in motion the events that would eventually put her cousin's signature on her death warrant. Let's talk about how a marriage went from bad to absolutely catastrophic. After the Rizzio murder, Mary's marriage to Darnley is effectively dead. Oh, they're still legally married, she's still carrying his child, but emotionally, it's over. Mary gives birth to their son, the future King James VI of Scotland, who'll eventually become James III of England, on June 19th, 1566. And even that joyful moment is tainted because Darnley barely shows up. The father of the heir to Scotland can't be bothered to properly acknowledge his own son. Mary's trapped in a marriage with a man she's grown to despise, surrounded by Scottish lords who blame her for the chaos, trying to rule a country that's becoming increasingly unstable. And then, on the cold morning of February 10th, 1567, everything explodes. Literally. It's around 2 a.m. at a place called Kirkfield, just outside Edinburgh. Darnley is staying there, supposedly recovering from smallpox or syphilis. Historians still debate which. He's in a small house, separate from the main palace, maybe for quarantine, maybe because Mary can't stand to be near him. The exact reasons are murky. But what happens next? Crystal clear. An explosion so massive it wakes up half of Edinburgh. The house is completely destroyed. Blown to pieces, rubble everywhere. And in the garden, they find Darnley's body, along with his servant's body. Here's where it gets weird. The bodies aren't burned. They're not crushed by debris. They're just lying in the garden, apparently strangled. Darnley's in his nightshirt, no visible injuries from the explosion, but definitely dead. So what actually happened? Was he killed before the explosion? Did he try to escape and get caught? Was the explosion meant to cover up a murder? Or was it meant to kill him but failed, so someone finished the job? To this day, we don't know for sure. It's one of history's great unsolved mysteries. But here's what we do know. Somebody wanted Darnley dead. Probably a lot of somebodies. Because Darnley had made enemies everywhere. The Protestant lords hated him for being Catholic-friendly. The Catholic lords hated him for being unreliable. Mary hated him for the Rizzio murder and his general awfulness. Half of Scotland had a motive. But the person who looks most suspicious, the Earl of Bothwell, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was one of Mary's most loyal supporters. He was a Scottish Protestant lord, powerful, military-minded, and absolutely devoted to Mary's cause. He'd stood by her through the Rizzio crisis. He'd helped protect her when other lords turned against her, and crucially, he'd been at Kirkfield that night. Multiple witnesses placed him near the scene. Now here's where Mary makes the decision that will haunt her for the rest of her life. In the immediate aftermath of Darnley's death, she does something incredibly strange. She doesn't seem all that broken up about it. I mean, yes, she goes into mourning. It's her husband, the father of her child. She has to observe the forms, but there's no great show of grief, no dramatic public mourning, no demanding immediate justice. She retreats to Holyrood Palace, puts on black, and basically waits. And people notice. The ambassadors notice. The other European courts notice. Elizabeth notices. They're all waiting to see. How will Mary respond to her husband's murder? Will she hunt down the killers? Will she seek revenge? And Mary does nothing decisive. She allows an investigation, but it's half-hearted. Bothwell is technically put on trial, but it's a show trial. He's acquitted within hours. No real evidence presented. No witnesses called. Just, Earl of Bothwell is innocent. Case closed. Why? Why would Mary, who should be furious about her husband's murder, even if it was a terrible husband, why would she protect the obvious suspect? This is the question that destroyed her reputation across Europe, because the conclusion everyone jumped to was obvious. Mary was involved. Mary knew about the plot. Maybe Mary even ordered it. She wanted Darnley dead. Bothwell arranged it, and now they're covering it up together. Was it true? We genuinely don't know. Some historians believe Mary was completely innocent, that she was as shocked as anyone. Others believe she knew something was going to happen but didn't stop it. A sin of omission rather than commission. Still others believe she actively participated in the planning. The evidence is contradictory, the sources are biased, and we're trying to solve a 450-year-old murder mystery with incomplete information. But here's what matters. Perception became reality. Whether Mary was guilty or innocent, Europe decided she was guilty. And what she does next makes everything infinitely worse. April 24th, 1567, just 10 weeks after Darnley's death. Mary's travelling from Edinburgh to Stirling Castle when she's intercepted by Bothwell and about 800 of his soldiers. He abducts her. I'm putting that in heavy quotes because historians debate whether this was a real kidnapping or staged theatre. He takes her to Dunbar Castle. They're alone there for several days. And then, on May 15th, 1567, less than 3 months after her husband's murder, Mary marries Bothwell. The man everyone believes killed her husband. She marries him, in a Protestant ceremony which alienates her Catholic supporters, without asking permission from anyone, without waiting a respectable mourning period. Just marries him. Can you imagine the scandal? Europe is absolutely scandalized. Not just shocked, scandalized. This isn't just poor judgment. This looks like proof of guilt. Because if Bothwell murdered Darnley and Mary immediately marries Bothwell, the obvious conclusion is that they were having an affair. They plotted the murder together, and now they're trying to legitimize their relationship. The optics could not possibly be worse. And here's the thing. Maybe Mary really was kidnapped. Maybe Bothwell forced her. Maybe she felt she had no choice because he'd compromised her reputation by keeping her at Dunbar. In 16th century terms, if a man abducts you and you're alone with him for days, you're ruined. Your honour is destroyed. Marriage is the only way to salvage anything. So maybe Mary married Bothwell not because she loved him, but because she felt trapped. Or maybe, and this is harder to think about, maybe she did love him. Maybe after years of terrible choices in men, after Francis who died, after Darnley who terrorised her, maybe Bothwell seemed like someone strong, loyal, capable. Maybe she convinced herself this could work, that marrying her most powerful supporter would stabilise her rule, that love and politics could finally align. But if that's what she thought, she was catastrophically wrong, because the marriage lasts about a month before everything falls apart. The Scottish lords rise up in rebellion. They're done with Mary. The Protestant lords, the Catholic lords, everyone unites in opposition because this Bothwell marriage is too much. They meet Mary's forces at Carberry Hill on June 15th, 1567. There's a standoff. No actual battle, just two armies facing each other. And the lords give Mary a choice: abandon Bothwell and return to rule, or fight and probably die. Mary chooses to abandon him. Bothwell flees to Denmark, where he'll eventually die in prison, completely insane. And Mary, the lords arrest her, imprison her, force her to abdicate the throne in favour of her 1-year-old son, James. Mary, Queen of Scots, who's been queen since she was 6 days old, who ruled Scotland and was briefly Queen of France, who survived political intrigue and religious warfare and multiple plots. She's deposed. Finished. At 24 years old, her reign is over. And all because of the Darnley disaster and the Bothwell scandal. All because she made choices that looked to everyone watching like guilt. Whether she was actually guilty of murdering her husband or not, she looked guilty. And in politics, appearance is everything. Elizabeth, watching all of this from England, must have felt vindicated. Every choice Mary made, marrying for love, trusting the wrong men, acting on emotion rather than calculation, proved Elizabeth's strategy right. Stay unmarried. Trust no one completely. Never give anyone ammunition to use against you. Elizabeth's cold, controlled approach looked better and better as Mary's warm, impulsive approach destroyed her. But here's the twist that makes this story so compelling. Mary's downfall makes her more sympathetic, not less. Yes, she made terrible decisions. Yes, she trusted the wrong people, but she was also a woman trying to survive impossible circumstances. She was 24 years old, ruling a hostile country with no real support system, making decisions under enormous pressure. Maybe she was guilty of murder, or maybe she was just guilty of bad judgment and worse luck. The mystery of Kirkerfield remains unsolved. We'll probably never know exactly what happened that February morning, but what we do know is this. Whatever happened, it destroyed Mary's life. It turned her from a queen into a fugitive, because after being deposed, after being imprisoned in Scotland, Mary is going to make one final gamble, one desperate attempt to salvage her life. She's going to escape Scotland and flee to England. She's going to throw herself on Elizabeth's mercy, her cousin, her rival, the woman whose throne she once claimed. Mary is going to believe that Elizabeth will help her, will support her, will honour the bonds of family and royalty and sisterhood. She's going to cross the border into England expecting sanctuary. And she's going to get a prison instead, a prison that will last 19 years. Because Elizabeth, looking at the scandal-plagued, reputation-destroyed, politically toxic Mary Queen of Scots, is going to make a cold calculation. This woman is dangerous alive and impossible to kill outright, so I'll keep her, under guard, under surveillance, under control, neither free nor executed, just frozen, for nearly 2 decades, and that's where the real tragedy begins. When the two cousins who never met face to face enter into a relationship that's part hostage situation, part psychological warfare, and entirely devastating. Mary's choices brought her to England. Elizabeth's calculation will keep her there until one of them dies. Let's see what happens when the queen who chose love meets the queen who chose power, and neither of them can escape each other anymore. May 16th, 1568. A small fishing boat crosses the Solway Firth from Scotland into England, carrying one passenger who's about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Mary Queen of Scots steps onto English soil believing she's escaping to safety. She's written to Elizabeth, her dear cousin, explaining everything. The rebellion in Scotland wasn't her fault. The Bothwell marriage was complicated. She needs temporary refuge while she gathers support to reclaim her throne. Surely Elizabeth, another queen who understands how difficult it is for women to rule, will help her. Mary expects maybe a few months of hospitality, a royal welcome, some diplomatic negotiations. Then she'll return to Scotland, restored to power, grateful to her cousin. Instead, she'll spend the next 19 years moving from castle to castle, always under guard, always under surveillance, writing letter after letter that changed nothing. 19 years. That's longer than some of you have been alive. Imagine spending that much time in limbo. Not quite a prisoner, not quite a guest, never knowing if you'll ever be free. And the cruelest part? Elizabeth never even comes to see her. Not once. They're going to spend nearly 2 decades in this twisted relationship, but they'll never meet face to face. So why didn't Elizabeth just help Mary? Or if she couldn't help her, why not just execute her and be done with it? Why this strange middle ground of comfortable captivity? Because Elizabeth was facing an impossible dilemma, and honestly, there was no good answer. Let me break down the options she was considering because each one was terrible in its own way. Option 1. Help Mary. Send English troops to Scotland, restore her to the throne, be the supportive cousin Mary expects. Sounds good, right? Except Mary is a Catholic queen with a claim to the English throne who just got tangled up in a possible murder scandal. If Elizabeth helps her back to power, she's strengthening a potential rival. Plus, England's relationship with Scotland is fragile. If Elizabeth invades Scotland to restore Mary, she might trigger a war she doesn't want. And what if Mary gets back in power and turns against her? What if Mary uses Scottish and French forces to press her claim to England? Too risky. Option 2. Send Mary back to Scotland as a prisoner. Hand her over to the Scottish lords who deposed her. Let them deal with her. But that's basically a death sentence. The Scottish lords would probably execute her within weeks. And here's the problem. Mary is still a queen, an anointed monarch. If Elizabeth allows another queen to be executed, she's setting a precedent that queens can be overthrown and killed by their subjects. That's terrifying for Elizabeth. Because if it's okay to execute the Queen of Scots, why not the Queen of England? Elizabeth is always worried about rebellion. She can't afford to normalise the idea that queens are disposable. Option 3. Execute Mary herself. Charge her with something. Treason, murder, conspiracy, and have her beheaded in England. Clean, final, eliminates the threat. But again, same problem. You can't execute queens without destabilising the entire concept of monarchy. Plus, Mary hasn't actually committed any crime against England. Yet. She's a foreign monarch seeking asylum. Executing her without clear legal grounds would make Elizabeth look like a tyrant. It would outrage Catholic Europe. Spain might invade. France might retaliate. It's politically explosive. So Elizabeth chooses option 4. Keep her. Just. Indefinitely keep her. Not as a guest, because guests can leave. Not as a prisoner, because prisoners have been convicted of crimes. Mary exists in this weird limbo where she's technically under Elizabeth's protection, but actually under house arrest. She's comfortable. Elizabeth makes sure of that because she's still royalty and must be treated appropriately, but she's not free, not even close. And this solution works for Elizabeth because it neutralises Mary without creating a precedent. Mary can't claim the English throne if she's locked up. She can't lead rebellions if she's under constant surveillance. She can't marry again and produce more heirs with Tudor blood. She's frozen in place, politically irrelevant, but still alive so Elizabeth doesn't have to deal with the consequences of executing her. For Mary, this is psychological torture. She moves from castle to castle, Carlisle Castle, Bolton Castle, Tutbury Castle, Sheffield Castle, Chartley Manor. Some of these places are nicer than others, but they're all prisons. She's allowed servants, about 30 of them, loyal people who came with her from Scotland or France. She's given nice rooms, good food, beautiful furnishings. She can do needlework. She becomes famous for her embroidery during these years. She can write letters, though they're all read by her jailers. She can ride horses sometimes, within strictly controlled areas. She can even keep pets, but she can't leave. She can't make her own decisions. She can't see her son James, who's growing up in Scotland without her, being raised Protestant, being told his mother is a murderer. She can't reclaim her throne. She can't even meet her cousin Elizabeth, despite begging for a face-to-face meeting for years. Do you know what 19 years feels like? Mary enters England at 25 years old. She's beautiful, charismatic, still in her prime. By the time she's executed, she'll be 44, her health destroyed by captivity, her hair gone grey, her body aged beyond her years. Nearly 2 decades of her life, just waiting, hoping, writing letters that accomplish nothing. And she writes so many letters to Elizabeth constantly. Dear cousin, please reconsider. Please see me in person. Please understand my situation. To foreign ambassadors, to Catholic supporters in Europe, to anyone who might help, she develops this whole coded correspondence system because she knows her jailers are reading everything. She uses ciphers, hidden messages, sympathetic servants who smuggle letters out. She's trying to maintain some connection to the outside world, some hope that this isn't permanent. Elizabeth writes back sometimes. These letters are fascinating because they're so careful. Elizabeth never promises anything concrete. She'll write things like, "We understand your distress and will consider your situation with all due care," which means exactly nothing. Or, "We must await a time when circumstances permit a meeting," which is code for never. Elizabeth is sympathetic, sort of, but she's also not budging. Mary stays locked up. Here's what I find psychologically devastating. Mary keeps believing Elizabeth will change her mind. For years, she holds on to this hope that if she just explains herself well enough, if she's patient enough, if she's respectful enough, Elizabeth will see reason and let her go. It's like being in a toxic relationship where you keep thinking the other person will finally understand you, will finally treat you fairly, but they never do. Mary can't accept that this is her life now, that this is permanent, and Elizabeth, she's probably conflicted. There's evidence she felt sympathy for Mary. They're cousins. They're both women trying to survive in a man's world. There's a part of Elizabeth that might have wanted to help. But Elizabeth's survival instinct is stronger than her sympathy. Every time she considers releasing Mary, her advisors remind her, Mary is a threat. Mary has a claim to your throne. Mary is a figurehead for every Catholic who wants you dead. Keep her locked up. And those advisors aren't wrong, because while Mary is in captivity, she becomes exactly what Elizabeth feared, a symbol, a rallying point for dissent. English Catholics who hate Elizabeth's Protestant rule start seeing Mary as their hope. If they can just remove Elizabeth, through uprising, through assassination, through invasion, they can replace her with Mary, the rightful Catholic queen with legitimate Tudor blood. Every plot against Elizabeth suddenly involves Mary, whether Mary wants to be involved or not. The Northern Rebellion happens in 1569, just a year after Mary arrives in England. Catholic nobles in the north rise up, demanding Elizabeth be replaced with Mary. It's crushed, brutally, but it proves Elizabeth's point. Keeping Mary alive is dangerous. Then in 1570, Pope Pius V issues this papal bull, basically an official decree, that excommunicates Elizabeth, declares her illegitimate, says Catholics don't owe her any loyalty. And more than that, it basically gives Catholics permission to overthrow her, even to kill her, because she's a heretic, a false queen, and removing her is God's work. Can you imagine living with that? Elizabeth is now officially marked for death by the Catholic Church, and Mary, whether she wants this or not, is the alternative they're offering. So from Elizabeth's perspective, every day Mary lives is a day Elizabeth's life is in danger, but executing Mary without clear evidence of treason against England would be politically catastrophic. So the status quo continues. Mary stays locked up. Elizabeth stays on guard. And neither of them can escape this situation. The years drag on. Mary's health deteriorates. The damp English castles are terrible for her. She develops rheumatism, constant pain. She gains weight from inactivity. Her beauty fades. The woman who once danced at the French court, who charmed ambassadors and wrote poetry, becomes this sedentary figure doing endless needlework and writing increasingly desperate letters. Her son James, who she hasn't seen since he was a baby, grows up in Scotland being taught that his mother is disgraceful. He starts corresponding with Elizabeth, not Mary. He makes it clear he doesn't want her back in Scotland. Her own son has essentially abandoned her. And Mary is radicalizing. The longer she's imprisoned, the more desperate she becomes, the more willing to consider extreme measures. At first, she just wants to be free, to reclaim her throne, to see her son. But as the years pass and nothing changes, she starts thinking, maybe the only way out is through Elizabeth's death. Maybe the plots aren't so bad. Maybe an invasion is justified. Maybe she does have the right to the English throne after all, and Elizabeth is the usurper who needs to be removed. This is what captivity does to people. It changes them. The Mary who entered England in 1568 hoping for temporary refuge is not the same woman who's still there in 1580 or 1585. Desperation makes you consider things you never would have before, and Elizabeth's advisors, especially her spymaster Francis Walsingham, are watching. They're reading every letter. They're tracking every plot. They're waiting for Mary to give them what they need. Clear, undeniable evidence that she's plotting against Elizabeth's life. Because if they can prove Mary is guilty of treason, not in Scotland, but in England, against Elizabeth specifically, then they can execute her without creating a dangerous precedent. It won't be killing a queen for being unpopular. It'll be executing a traitor for attempting to murder the rightful monarch. That's legal. That's justifiable. That's something Elizabeth can explain to Europe without triggering war. But they need proof, hard evidence, Mary's own words, in her own hand, approving a plot to kill Elizabeth. And Walsingham, brilliant and ruthless, is going to engineer a situation where Mary gives them exactly that. He's going to lay a trap so perfect, so carefully constructed, that Mary will walk right into it and seal her own fate. The 19-year waiting game is about to end. The psychological warfare is about to become literal, because what comes next involves beer barrels, coded letters, young conspirators with romantic notions, and a spymaster who knows exactly how to turn desperation into evidence. Mary has been frozen in place for 2 decades, but she's about to make one final move. And that move will be exactly what Walsingham has been waiting for. Let's talk about how the perfect trap gets set for a desperate queen. There's a man we need to talk about because he's the puppet master behind everything that's about to happen. His name is Sir Francis Walsingham, and if he'd been born in the 20th century, he would have been running the CIA or MI6. This guy essentially invented modern espionage. He built a spy network that stretched across Europe, employed dozens of agents and double agents, intercepted thousands of letters, cracked codes, and infiltrated enemy organizations so thoroughly that he probably knew about plots against Elizabeth before the plotters themselves fully understood what they were planning. And his entire operation had one goal: keep Elizabeth alive and destroy Mary, Queen of Scots. Not because he hated Mary personally, though he definitely wasn't a fan, but because he genuinely believed that as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth would never be safe. He saw Mary as a loaded gun pointed at England, and Walsingham was determined to make that gun misfire in a way that would legally justify execution. Let me paint you a picture of what Walsingham's spy network looked like, because it's genuinely impressive and terrifying at the same time. Imagine you're a Catholic exile living in Paris, and you're thinking about maybe supporting a plot against Elizabeth. You confide in a friend who knows someone who introduces you to a sympathetic English priest. That priest puts you in touch with an agent who claims to have connections in England. You start planning, you write letters, you think you're being careful. What you don't know is that the sympathetic priest, Walsingham's man, the agent with connections, Walsingham's man, the courier who's supposed to deliver your letters to England, definitely Walsingham's man, the person receiving your letters in England, you guessed it, working for Walsingham. Your entire conspiracy is actually a Walsingham production, and you're the only one who doesn't know it. This is what Walsingham did. He planted agents in Catholic communities across Europe, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Rome. He recruited people who could travel freely between countries. Some were genuine believers who supported Elizabeth. Others were mercenaries who worked for money. Still others were people he'd compromised, who spied for him because refusing meant exposure and death. He ran dozens of these agents simultaneously, each thinking they were his only source, each feeding him information that he'd pieced together like a puzzle. And the centerpiece of his operation, Thomas Philippus. If Walsingham was the director, Philippus was the technical genius. This guy was a cryptographer, a code breaker, and he was phenomenally good at it. In an age where secure communication meant using cipher codes that substituted symbols for letters, Philippus could crack almost any code given enough time and examples. He'd study encrypted letters, look for patterns, figure out the system, and decode entire conspiracies. He could also forge handwriting so perfectly that even the person whose writing he was imitating couldn't tell the difference. Think about that for a second. Walsingham could intercept your letter, have Philippus decode it, read all your secrets, forge an addendum in your own handwriting asking for more information, and send it along. The recipient would never know the letter had been tampered with, and when they replied with the additional information you requested, Walsingham would have even more evidence. It's brilliant and absolutely ruthless. Now, Walsingham didn't start with the Babington plot. He'd been tracking conspiracies against Elizabeth for years, and he'd already taken down several major plots involving Mary. Let me tell you about two of them, because they show you how this man operated. First, the Ridolfi plot in 1571. Roberto Ridolfi was an Italian banker living in England who started organising a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, one of England's most powerful nobles, and restore Catholicism with Spanish military support. It was elaborate, well-funded, and involved some serious players. Walsingham infiltrated it completely. His agents discovered the plot, tracked every participant, intercepted the letters between conspirators. The Duke of Norfolk was arrested and executed in 1572. Ridolfi escaped to Europe, but his network was destroyed. And Mary? They found letters proving she knew about the plot, but still not enough to execute her. She could claim she was just a passive recipient of information, not an active conspirator. Then the Throckmorton plot in 1583. Francis Throckmorton was a young English Catholic who was coordinating between Mary, Spanish ambassadors, and Catholic exiles in France. The plan involved a Spanish invasion, an English Catholic uprising, Elizabeth's assassination, and Mary's placement on the throne. Sound familiar? It's basically the same plan as Ridolfi, different players. Walsingham tracked this one for months before making arrests. When they raided Throckmorton's house, they found coded letters, lists of safe Catholic houses, plans for invasion ports, under torture, and yes, they used torture. Throckmorton confessed everything. He was executed. The Spanish ambassador was expelled, and again, Mary was implicated but not definitively enough for execution. Can you see the pattern? Plot after plot, and Mary is always connected but never quite provably guilty of direct treason against Elizabeth. She's always just informed about plans, or expressing sympathy with Catholic causes, or corresponding with people who happen to be conspirators. She's careful, or her advisors are careful for her, to never explicitly write, "Yes, please murder my cousin Elizabeth so I can take her throne." Without that smoking gun, Elizabeth can't execute her without looking tyrannical. But Walsingham knows it's only a matter of time, because Mary is getting desperate. By 1585, she's been imprisoned for 17 years. She's in her early 40s, her health is failing, her son has essentially disowned her, and she's running out of hope. Desperate people make mistakes, and Walsingham is patient. He can wait for Mary to make the mistake he needs, so he creates the perfect conditions for that mistake. In late 1585, Mary is moved to Chartley Manor in Staffordshire. Her new jailer is Sir Amyas Paulet, a rigid Puritan who hates Catholics and treats Mary with barely disguised contempt. It's deliberate choice. Elizabeth's previous jailers had been somewhat sympathetic to Mary, treating her with the respect due to royalty. Paulet treats her like a prisoner. He cuts off her access to the outside world. No more letters getting through. No more news from France or Scotland. Mary is completely isolated, and this isolation is strategic. Because when you cut someone off completely, and then suddenly offer them a lifeline, they'll grab it without questioning whether it's a trap. Which is exactly what Walsingham is counting on. Enter Gilbert Gifford. This guy is one of history's great double agents. He was a young English Catholic who'd been living in exile in France, training as a priest. He comes back to England in late 1585, and immediately Walsingham arrests him. Gifford has a choice: work for Walsingham as a double agent or face execution for treason. He chooses survival. Walsingham sends him to make contact with the French embassy in London, where Mary's supporters are desperate to re-establish communication with her. Gifford tells them he's found a way to smuggle letters to Mary. A local brewer delivers ale to Chartley Manor in large barrels. What if they hid letters inside the barrels, sealed in waterproof pouches tucked into the hollow bung of the barrel? The letters go into the barrel before delivery. Mary's servants retrieve them once the barrel is inside Chartley, and Mary gets her mail. For outgoing letters, reverse the process. It seems perfect, secret, secure, untraceable. Except the brewer is working for Walsingham, and Gifford is working for Walsingham, and every single letter going in or out of those beer barrels goes straight to Walsingham and Philippe's first. They open it, decode it, read it, copy it, reseal it, and send it along. Mary thinks she's finally re-established secure communication with the outside world. She has no idea that every word she writes is being read by the people trying to destroy her. This is entrapment in its purest form. Walsingham has cut Mary off from all legitimate communication, then provided her with what seems like a secret channel, knowing she'll use it. He's given her enough rope to hang herself, and now he's just waiting to see if she'll tie the noose. And into this carefully constructed trap walks Anthony Babington. He's 25 years old, handsome, wealthy, Catholic, and hopelessly romantic about Mary's cause. As a teenager, he'd been a page in the household of the Earl of Shrewsbury, one of Mary's earlier jailers. He'd seen Mary, been charmed by her, and developed this chivalric devotion to her cause. He's exactly the kind of young idealist who's dangerous, passionate enough to act but inexperienced enough to be manipulated. Babington is connected to a Jesuit priest named John Ballard, who's been travelling around Europe drumming up support for a plot against Elizabeth. Ballard convinces Babington that the time is right. Catholic Spain is ready to invade. English Catholics are ready to rise up. All they need is someone to assassinate Elizabeth, and then Mary can be rescued and placed on the throne. It'll be glorious. righteous, a blow for the true faith against a heretic queen, and Babington, God help him, believes it. He starts planning. He recruits 6 friends to be the actual assassins, young Catholic gentlemen willing to die for the cause. And crucially, he wants Mary's approval. He wants her blessing. He wants to know that when he kills Elizabeth, Mary will support him and reward him. So he writes to Mary, using the beer barrel method that Gilbert Gifford has arranged, not knowing that Gifford is a double agent, not knowing that the beer barrel is a highway straight to Walsingham's desk. Babington writes a long letter outlining the entire plot in detail. 6 men to assassinate Elizabeth, a larger force to rescue Mary from Chartley, a foreign army to invade and support them, all very specific, all very damning. And he asks Mary, "Do you approve?" The letter goes into the beer barrel. Walsingham's men take it out. Felipe's decodes it. Babington used a cipher, but Felipe's cracks it within hours. They copy everything. Then they seal it back up and send it on to Mary at Chartley. Mary receives it on July 14th, 1586. She reads about this elaborate plot to kill her cousin and place her on the throne, and she has to decide, how should she respond? This is the moment Walsingham has been engineering for years. Mary is isolated, desperate, offered what looks like a real chance at freedom. She's being asked to approve a plot, and if she says yes explicitly, that's treason. Clear, undeniable, executable treason. Not vague sympathy with Catholic causes, not passive receipt of information, active participation in a plot to assassinate the Queen of England. So what does Mary write back? Does she condemn the plot? Does she tell Babington he's being foolish and should abandon this dangerous plan? Does she refuse to participate in any assassination scheme? Or does she see this as her last chance, her only hope after 17 years of captivity, and give the approval that will seal her fate? The answer Mary writes will determine whether she lives or dies, and Walsingham, sitting in London with his network of spies and his codebreaker Felipe's, is waiting to read that answer the moment she sends it. The trap is set. The bait is taken. Now, we just need to see if Mary will spring it. And when she does, there will be no more delays, no more legal ambiguity, no more impossible dilemmas for Elizabeth. There will just be evidence, trial, and execution. Let's find out exactly what Mary wrote and why those words became her death sentence. July 17th, 1586. 3 days after receiving Babington's letter, Mary sits down to write her response. Can you imagine what's going through her mind? 17 years of captivity. 17 years of writing letters that changed nothing, begging for mercy that never came, watching her life slip away in these drafty castles. And now, finally, someone is offering action. Real action. A concrete plan to free her. Young men willing to risk their lives for her cause. A foreign army ready to invade. Everything she's hoped for, laid out in detail. But there's a catch. The plan requires Elizabeth's death. Not imprisonment, not dethronement. Assassination. 6 men with daggers, ending the life of her cousin, the Queen of England. And Babington wants Mary's blessing, her approval, her involvement. This isn't just information being shared with her anymore. This is asking her to be complicit in murder. So Mary writes back. And what she writes is, even now, over 400 years later, debated by historians. Because Mary doesn't write, "Yes, kill Elizabeth." She's too careful for that. Too aware that letters can be intercepted, though she doesn't know this one definitely will be. But she also doesn't write, "No, absolutely not. Abandon this plan immediately." Instead, she writes something in between. something that gives approval without explicitly saying the words. In her letter, Mary outlines the practical considerations for the plot. She stresses that everything must be carefully coordinated. The rescue must happen quickly after the 6 gentlemen complete their task. She doesn't say assassination, just their task. But everyone knows what that means. She emphasizes the need for a real foreign invasion, not promises of troops that never arrive. She wants to make sure she's actually rescued before her jailer discovers what's happened. It's all very practical, very detailed. And here's the crucial part. She never says, "Don't kill Elizabeth." She never condemns the assassination. She just proceeds as if it's already decided and focuses on logistics. When you read her letter, it's clear she's approving the plot. She's participating, she's guilty, but she's trying to maintain just enough plausible deniability that if the letter is discovered, maybe she can claim she was just cautiously responding to information, not actively plotting. But that plausible deniability, it's not enough. Not for what's about to happen. The letter goes into the beer barrel. Mary's servants seal it up, thinking they're so clever with their secret system. The barrel goes out of Chartley, and before it gets anywhere near Babington, it lands on Walsingham's desk. Felipes decodes it within hours. By now, he knows Mary's cipher system by heart. He reads her response, and he knows immediately, this is it. This is the smoking gun they've been waiting years to find. Felipes is so certain this letter is Mary's death sentence that he draws a gallows symbol on the outside of the decoded copy. A little stick figure gallows. His way of saying, "We've got her. She's done. This letter just killed the Queen of Scots." Then he sends a copy to Walsingham with this gallows mark, and the original encrypted letter continues on to Babington. But Walsingham isn't satisfied with just Mary's approval. He wants the names of all the conspirators. Who are these 6 assassins? Who else is involved? He needs to round up the entire network, not just the ringleaders. So he does something audacious. He has Felipes forge a postscript to Mary's letter. In her handwriting, using her cipher, Felipes adds a few lines that say essentially, "By the way, please send me the names of the 6 gentlemen who will undertake this service." Asking for the names of the assassins, the forged letter reaches Babington. He reads Mary's approval, genuine. He reads her request for names, forged, but he doesn't know that. And like the trusting young idealist he is, he writes back with all the details. Names, locations, plans, everything. He's so excited to have Mary's support that he doesn't question why she's suddenly asking for specifics she doesn't need. He just hands Walsingham his entire conspiracy network on a silver platter. August 1586. The arrests begin. Walsingham's men round up Babington and his co-conspirators. Some try to flee, but Walsingham's network is too thorough. Babington is captured, and at first he tries to play innocent, but they show him the decoded letters. They show him Mary's response. They show him his own detailed plans. There's no denying it. He confesses, names everyone involved, tells them everything. The trial happens quickly. Babington and 13 co-conspirators are convicted of treason, and their sentence is what we'd now call cruel and unusual punishment. Actually, it was normal for the time, which tells you how brutal the 16th century was. They're sentenced to hanging, drawing and quartering, which means you're hanged until almost dead, cut down while still alive, then disemboweled while conscious, and finally cut into pieces. It's designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. September the 20th, 1586. The first 7 conspirators are executed at St. Giles in the Field in London. Babington goes first. Witnesses report that the executioners carry out the full horrific sentence. The men die screaming. The crowd is apparently disturbed by how gruesome it is, and Elizabeth, when she hears about it, is reportedly troubled too. The next day, when the remaining 7 conspirators are executed, she orders the executioners to let them hang until they're fully dead before the rest of the sentence. A small mercy in a sea of brutality. These men died for Mary, young, idealistic Catholics who genuinely believed they were fighting for the true faith and a wronged queen. Were they guilty of treason? Absolutely. Did they deserve that level of suffering? That's a question people still debate. But their deaths accomplish one thing. They prove how serious this plot was. These weren't just talkers. These were men ready to kill a queen. And now Walsingham turns his attention to Mary, because she's the real target, always has been. The conspirators were just means to an end. Mary is moved from Chartley to Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, a more secure location, harder to escape from, and in October 1586 she's put on trial. Now this trial is not exactly fair by modern standards. Mary is not allowed to have legal counsel. She's not allowed to see the evidence against her beforehand. She can't call witnesses in her defence. She stands alone in a room full of English lords and bishops, 46 of them, who've already decided she's guilty. The trial is more theatre than justice, a formality to give Elizabeth legal cover for what's about to happen. Mary's defence is actually pretty interesting. She claims she's not subject to English law because she's a foreign queen, not an English subject. How can she commit treason against a country she doesn't belong to? She admits she wanted to be free. Who wouldn't after 17 years of captivity? But she denies plotting to kill Elizabeth. She says the letters were forged, or taken out of context, or that she was entrapped into writing things she didn't mean. And honestly, she has a point about the entrapment. Walsingham did engineer this entire situation. He cut off her legitimate communication, provided a secret channel he controlled, and basically created the conditions for her to incriminate herself. If this happened today, a good lawyer might argue entrapment and get the evidence thrown out. But this is 1586, and there are no good lawyers for Mary, and the concept of illegal entrapment doesn't exist yet. The court doesn't care about her arguments. They read portions of her letters aloud, Babington's letter, her response, the damning details. Mary keeps denying, but her own words, even without the forged postscript, are enough. The court convicts her of treason. All 46 members agree. Well, actually, one lord reportedly voted not guilty, but he was overruled. Mary, Queen of Scots, anointed monarch, is now a convicted traitor sentenced to death. But here's where things get complicated for Elizabeth, because convicting Mary is one thing. Actually executing her, that's terrifying. Remember, Elizabeth has spent 17 years keeping Mary alive because executing queens sets a dangerous precedent. Now Parliament, her advisors, the public, everyone's demanding Mary's death. The evidence is clear. The threat is real. Justice demands execution. But Elizabeth hesitates. For months, she agonizes over this decision. She signs the death warrant, then changes her mind. Her advisors prepare everything, and she tells them to wait. She writes to Mary's son James in Scotland, asking if he'd be upset if his mother were executed. James basically says, "Do what you need to do, just don't mess up my succession to the English throne." Cold, but pragmatic. He barely remembers his mother, and his interests lie with staying on Elizabeth's good side. Elizabeth tries to find another way. She asks Mary's jailer, Sir Amyas Paulet, if he'd be willing to just quietly kill Mary, make it look like an accident or natural causes, avoid the whole public execution spectacle. Paulet, to his credit, refuses. He's a rigid Puritan who hates Mary, but he won't commit murder. If Elizabeth wants Mary dead, she needs to do it legally and publicly. So Elizabeth finally signs the death warrant. February 1st, 1587, her signature on the document that will end her cousin's life. But even then, she tells her advisors, "Don't rush this. Let me think about it more." She's clearly hoping they'll just not do it, give her time to change her mind again, but her advisors are done waiting. William Cecil, her closest advisor for decades, and the rest of the Privy Council make a decision. Execute Mary immediately, before Elizabeth changes her mind again. They send the warrant to Fotheringhay Castle right away. They don't tell Elizabeth, they just do it, because they believe, probably correctly, that if they give Elizabeth any more time she'll back out, and this cycle will continue forever. Mary will remain alive and dangerous, plots will keep happening, and eventually one of those plots might succeed. So on the morning of February 8th, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, is informed that she will be executed that day. After 19 years of captivity, after months of trial and appeals, her time has run out. She has a few hours to prepare herself, to pray, to write final letters, to make peace with her death. And the woman who'd once been queen of 2 countries, who danced at the French court and charmed ambassadors, who'd survived political intrigue and multiple plots and nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, has to face the fact that her cousin, the woman she never met, the woman whose throne she once claimed, has signed her death warrant. The executioner's block is being prepared. The great hall at Fotheringhay is being set up. 300 witnesses are gathering, and Mary is choosing what to wear, writing her final words, deciding how she wants to be remembered. Because if she can't control how she lives anymore, she can at least control how she dies. And what happens in that hall, the dignity, the drama, the devastating final moments, will echo through history and complicate Mary's legacy in ways that even execution can't erase. Let's witness the end of a queen who bet everything on the wrong cousins and lost. The night before her execution, Mary doesn't sleep much. How could she? She spends the hours writing letters to the King of France, to her servants, to anyone she thinks might care. She writes instructions for her burial. She prays, and she makes a very deliberate choice about what she'll wear for her final performance. Because make no mistake, Mary understands that her execution is theatre, and she's going to control the narrative one last time. February 8th, 1587. Around 8 in the morning, Mary's brought into the great hall at Fotheringhay Castle. 300 people are watching. Nobles, officials, local gentry who've been summoned to witness this historic moment. The room is cold. There's a wooden platform raised about 2 feet off the ground, draped in black cloth. In the centre, a wooden block. Next to it, 2 executioners wearing black masks. This is it, the final scene. Mary enters wearing black, as expected for a condemned prisoner. But then, in what becomes one of the most brilliant pieces of symbolic theatre in history, her servants help her remove the black outer garments. Underneath, she's wearing a deep crimson-red dress and petticoat. Blood red, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. She's not going to die as a criminal. She's going to die as a martyr for her faith. It's a deliberate message to Catholic Europe. I am being murdered for my religion, not for any crime. Remember me as a victim of Protestant persecution. The officials read the death warrant aloud. Mary listens calmly. When they finish, she's asked if she has any final words, and she does. She proclaims her innocence, not of the plot necessarily, but of any desire to harm England. She says she dies for her Catholic faith. She forgives her enemies, including Elizabeth, though that forgiveness probably stings more than any curse could. Then she asks her servants to pray for her in Latin. which the Protestant officials try to stop, but Mary insists. These are her last moments. She'll pray how she wants. Her servants are crying. These people have been with her through years of captivity, and now they're watching her die. Mary stays composed. She has to. This is her final act of queenship, showing dignity in the face of death. She asks the executioner to be quick, and she forgives him for what he's about to do. Then her ladies help her to the block. Here's where we need to talk about the gruesome reality, because history doesn't spare us the details. Mary kneels at the block. She places her head down. The executioner raises his axe, and he misses. Not completely. He strikes her head but doesn't sever it. He hits the back of her head and neck. Mary doesn't cry out. The second blow hits better, but still doesn't completely sever the head. It takes a third blow, and even then the executioner has to use the axe like a saw to finish cutting through the remaining tissue and bone. Can you imagine being in that room? The witnesses are horrified. This wasn't supposed to be botched. This was supposed to be quick, clean, dignified. Instead, it's a nightmare. The executioner finally lifts Mary's head by the hair to show the crowd, as was traditional, proof that the execution was complete. But Mary had been wearing a wig. The head falls from his hand, hitting the platform while he's left holding the auburn wig. Her real hair underneath was grey and cropped short from years in captivity. And then, this detail breaks my heart every time, a small dog emerges from beneath Mary's skirts. Her little Skye Terrier had been hiding there the whole time, and now it refuses to leave her body. The servants have to carry the dog away, and it reportedly died shortly after, possibly from refusing to eat. Even in death, Mary had a companion who was loyal to the end. The hall is silent except for people crying. Some of the officials are visibly shaken. This wasn't a triumph of justice. This felt like something much darker. The body is taken away immediately. Elizabeth had given strict orders that Mary be buried quickly and quietly, with no ceremony that could turn her grave into a shrine for Catholic pilgrims. They even burn Mary's clothes to prevent them from becoming holy relics. Everything is calculated to minimize Mary's martyrdom. But you can't control the story once it leaves that room. News travels slowly in 1587, but it travels. Within days, all of England knows Mary is dead. Within weeks, Europe knows, and the reactions are complicated. English Protestants celebrate. The threat is finally gone. The Catholic figurehead who inspired plots against Elizabeth for decades is dead. But Catholics across Europe are outraged. Mary becomes exactly what Elizabeth feared, a martyr. Artists paint her execution. Poets write about her tragic life. The Pope declares her a saint in all but official title. She becomes a symbol of Catholic persecution under Protestant rule. And Elizabeth, when her counsellors finally tell her that Mary has been executed, she is absolutely furious. Whether this rage is genuine or political theatre, historians still debate. She claims she never meant for the warrant to be carried out. She says her counsellors betrayed her trust. She has William Davison, the secretary who delivered the warrant to Fotheringhay, arrested and thrown in the Tower of London. He's fined massively and loses his position. Elizabeth claims he acted without authorization, which is technically true but also convenient. Is Elizabeth's rage real? Maybe. She'd been agonizing over this decision for months, and her counsellors took it out of her hands. That could genuinely infuriate her, not because Mary died, but because they made her look like she couldn't control her own government. Or maybe, and this is the more cynical interpretation, Elizabeth knew exactly what her counsellors were doing, tacitly approved by not stopping them, and then threw them under the bus publicly to maintain her image. I didn't want to kill my cousin. My advisors forced my hand. I'm the victim here too. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Elizabeth was genuinely conflicted about executing Mary. The precedent terrified her. The political fallout worried her. But she also knew Mary had to die for England to be safe. So maybe she let her counsellors make the decision for her, gave them just enough rope to act, and then punished them publicly to cover her own involvement. It's messy and human and politically brilliant all at once. But regardless of Elizabeth's feelings, Mary is dead. The woman who claimed 3 crowns, Scotland, France and England, dies with none of them. The woman who married 3 times for love and politics ends up destroyed by both. The woman who spent 19 years in captivity, writing letters and doing needlework and hoping for rescue, dies on a scaffold in front of strangers. 44 years old. Her son doesn't mourn her. He's too busy securing his future with Elizabeth. Her cousin doesn't visit her grave. The French court that once adored her moves on. And yet, somehow, Mary wins the legacy battle. Because here's what's fascinating. We're still talking about her over 400 years later. We're still debating whether she was guilty or entrapped. We're still analysing her choices, her letters, her marriages, her mistakes. She's been the subject of countless books, films, plays, operas. People are still fascinated by her story. She's still compelling. Elizabeth lived another 16 years after Mary's death. She went on to defeat the Spanish Armada, solidify Protestant England, become one of the most successful monarchs in English history. But when people think of Elizabeth and Mary, they don't just remember Elizabeth's victories. They remember the rivalry, the tragedy, the 2 queens who never met but defined each other's lives. Here's the question that haunts me. Did Elizabeth make the right choice? From a political survival standpoint, absolutely. Keeping Mary alive was dangerous. Every day Mary lived was a day Elizabeth's enemies had a figurehead to rally around. Mary's death effectively ended the serious Catholic threats against Elizabeth's reign. The Spanish Armada came in 1588, just 1 year after Mary's execution. But without Mary as an alternative queen, the invasion had less legitimacy. Elizabeth survived, thrived even, and England became a Protestant power that would shape world history. But from a human standpoint, Elizabeth lost too. She lost the possibility of reconciliation with the only other woman who truly understood what it meant to be a queen in their era. She lost the chance to meet face to face with her cousin. She set a precedent that monarchs could be executed, which would come back to haunt future English royalty. Charles III would be beheaded in 1649, partly because Mary's execution proved that even anointed monarchs weren't untouchable, and she had to live with knowing she'd signed her own family member's death warrant. Whether that bothered her genuinely or just politically, we'll never know. Mary made terrible choices. She trusted the wrong men, married disastrously, failed to understand the brutal nature of political survival, but she tried to be both a queen and a woman, both powerful and loving, both strategic and authentic. And the world of 16th century politics punished her for that attempt. Elizabeth made ruthless choices. She sacrificed personal happiness, family ties, romantic love, all for power and survival, and she was rewarded with a long reign and historical glory. But she died alone, unmarried, with no children, having never experienced the intimacy Mary craved. 2 women, 2 strategies for surviving impossible circumstances. One died young on a scaffold, one died old in a palace. Both paid prices we can barely imagine. And the legacy they left behind, the letters, the plots, the rivalry, the tragedy, still captivates us because it asks questions we still struggle with. How much should you sacrifice for power? When is survival worth the cost of your humanity? Can women have both strength and softness? Or must they choose? Is it better to live authentically and die young, or live strategically and die powerful but alone? There are no easy answers. There never were. But what happened after Mary's death, the way her execution changed England, the way the Spanish responded, the way Elizabeth's final years unfolded, and the ultimate irony of who ended up on the English throne, that's where the story gets its final devastating twist. Because Mary lost every battle during her life, but in the end, her bloodline won the war. Let's talk about how a dead Scottish queen managed to claim the English throne after all, and what that tells us about the price both women paid for their choices. Here's the twist that makes this entire tragic story almost darkly funny in its irony. Mary's son, James, the baby boy she gave birth to in 1566, the child she was separated from when he was less than a year old, the son who grew up calling her a murderer and refused to help her, becomes King of England. Not just Scotland, England too. The throne Elizabeth spent her entire life protecting. The crown Mary died claiming. It ends up going to Mary's bloodline anyway. March 24th, 1603. Elizabeth dies at Richmond Palace at the age of 69. She'd ruled England for 45 years, longer than most people lived back then. She never married, never had children, and despite decades of pressure and proposals, she kept her promise to die the Virgin Queen. And with no direct heir, the crown passes to the nearest legitimate relative with royal blood. That's James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, who becomes James III of England. Think about that for a second. Elizabeth executed Mary partly to protect her throne from Mary's claim. She kept Mary imprisoned for 19 years because Mary was a threat to her succession. She died without children specifically to maintain absolute power and avoid sharing it with a husband. And then the throne goes to Mary's child anyway. Everything Elizabeth did to prevent Mary's bloodline from claiming England, it didn't matter. History had other plans, and here's the even wilder part. Every British monarch since 1603 has been descended from Mary Queen of Scots. Not Elizabeth. Queen Victoria, Mary's descendant. Queen Elizabeth II, Mary's descendant. King Charles III today, Mary's descendant. The current British royal family traces its lineage through Mary Stuart. Elizabeth's bloodline ended with her. Mary's continues to this day, sitting on the throne of the United Kingdom. So who really won? The question is more complicated than it seems. Elizabeth won the battle. She lived longer, ruled successfully, became one of England's greatest monarchs. But Mary won the dynasty. Elizabeth got power and glory in her lifetime. Mary got legacy and lineage forever. It's almost like the universe said, you can choose power or you can choose family, but you can't have both. Elizabeth chose power. Mary, despite all her mistakes, chose love and family. And in the long run, Mary's choice outlasted Elizabeth's. But let's talk about what happened immediately after Mary's death, because there were consequences. Big ones. King Philip II of Spain had been looking for an excuse to invade England for years. He hated Elizabeth's Protestant policies, hated England's support for Dutch rebels against Spanish rule, and saw England as a heretic nation that needed to be conquered and returned to Catholicism. Mary's execution gave him the perfect justification. In 1588, just 1 year after Mary's death, Spain launches the Spanish Armada. It's the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, planning to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and install a Catholic monarchy. This is exactly what Elizabeth feared when she hesitated to execute Mary. By killing a Catholic queen, she'd given Catholic Europe a martyr and a reason for war. But here's where Elizabeth's decades of careful political strategy pay off. England defeats the Spanish Armada through a combination of superior naval tactics, lucky weather that scatters the Spanish ships, and years of Elizabeth building up England's navy. It's one of the greatest military victories in English history, and it solidifies Protestant England as a major European power. Elizabeth's supporters see it as God's approval of her reign. The Protestant Queen defeats the Catholic Empire. If Mary had still been alive during the Armada, the invasion might have had more legitimacy, a clearer goal of placing Mary on the throne. But with Mary dead, the invasion was just Spanish aggression, easier to resist. So in a strange way, Mary's death, as tragic and brutal as it was, might have actually saved England from Spanish conquest. If Elizabeth had kept delaying, kept Mary alive through 1588, the Armada might have succeeded. The timing, horrible as it was for Mary, worked out for England. Sometimes history is just brutally pragmatic like that. Elizabeth lives another 16 years after the Armada, growing older, more isolated, but also more legendary. She never stops working, never stops performing the role of queen. But she's alone. Robert Dudley, the love of her life, dies in 1588. Most of her closest advisors die before her. She outlives almost everyone from her youth. And in her final years, there are reports that she's melancholic, struggling with the loneliness of her choices. She got everything she wanted: power, respect, a successful reign, but at the cost of everything else. When she's asked about her successor in her final days, she reportedly says, "Who should succeed me but a king?" And when pressed for a name, she finally says, "I will that a king succeed me, and who but my kinsman the King of Scotland?" She's talking about James, Mary's son. It must have been complicated for Elizabeth, knowing that the son of the woman she executed would inherit everything she'd spent her life building. But she's pragmatic to the end. James is the logical choice. Legitimate blood, already a king, Protestant despite his mother's Catholicism. England and Scotland would be united under one crown. So what are we supposed to take from this story? What's the lesson from these two women who never met but defined each other's lives? I don't think there's one simple answer. But here's what strikes me. Elizabeth and Mary represent two different approaches to an impossible situation. They were both women trying to rule in a world that didn't believe women should rule. They both faced constant pressure, threats, plots, and the fundamental challenge of being taken seriously in a male-dominated society. But they responded in completely opposite ways. Elizabeth built walls. She protected herself through isolation, strategy, and the refusal to show vulnerability. She became untouchable by becoming unavailable, emotionally, romantically, dynastically. She played the game better than anyone, but the game required her to give up parts of her humanity. She died powerful but alone. Mary tried to stay open. She loved, trusted, married, hoped. She believed in the possibility of having both power and intimacy, both authority and authenticity. And the world punished her for it. Every time she showed vulnerability, it was used against her. Every time she trusted someone, they betrayed her or failed her. She died young and broken, but she'd at least tried to live fully. Neither approach was wrong. They were just different solutions to the same impossible problem. And here's what I find most moving about their story. They both paid terrible prices for their choices. Elizabeth gave up love and family. Mary gave up her freedom and eventually her life. There was no winning strategy, just different ways of losing. But their legacies tell us something important. We remember both of them. We're still fascinated by both of them. Elizabeth gets respect for her political genius and her successful reign. Mary gets sympathy for her tragic life and her attempt to be fully human while fully powerful. They represent two sides of an eternal question. Should you prioritize survival or authenticity? strategy or emotion, head or heart? And maybe the answer is that we need both. Maybe we need the Elizabeths of the world, strategic, careful, thinking 10 steps ahead. But we also need the Marys, passionate, hopeful, willing to risk everything for connection. The tragedy is when the world forces you to choose one completely at the expense of the other. Look at their story from a modern perspective. How many of you have felt the pressure to choose between career success and personal relationships? Between protecting yourself emotionally and being vulnerable enough to connect? Between playing it safe and taking risks that might lead to either great joy or great pain? Elizabeth and Mary's story is 450 years old, but these questions are timeless. What would have happened if they'd actually met? If they'd sat down face to face, without ambassadors and letters and political posturing, and just talked as cousins, as women, as queens dealing with impossible circumstances? Could they have found common ground? Could they have helped each other instead of destroying each other? We'll never know. But the fact that they never met feels like the saddest part of the whole story. Two women who might have been allies, might have understood each other better than anyone else could, kept apart by politics and fear and the brutal logic of power. In the end, their rivalry wasn't really about who was the better queen. It was about two different philosophies of survival colliding in a world that had no space for either of them to succeed on their own terms. They were both remarkable women. They both deserved to be remembered. And they both paid prices that no one should have to pay for the simple act of existing as powerful women in a world run by men. So here we are, over 400 years later, still talking about Elizabeth and Mary, still debating their choices, still trying to understand how two baby girls born into royal families ended up locked in a rivalry that would kill one and haunt the other. Their story reminds us that history is made by real people with real emotions, making impossible choices under terrible pressure. It reminds us that there are no easy answers when you're trying to survive in a world that fundamentally doesn't want you to succeed. And it reminds us that legacy is strange and unpredictable. Elizabeth got the glory, Mary got the martyrdom. But Mary's blood flows through every British monarch since. Her son united England and Scotland. Her story became legend. She lost everything in life but won something in death. She became unforgettable. And maybe that's its own kind of victory. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible, tragic, fascinating story. I know it's been a long journey. 2 hours together, travelling through the lives of two remarkable queens. I hope you found it as compelling as I do. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if you're lying there now wondering about your own choices between safety and authenticity, between strategy and heart, please let me know in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, there are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of power and betrayal, love and loss, impossible choices and unexpected consequences. History is full of these human dramas that echo across centuries. So subscribe if you haven't already, because there's always another story waiting for us to explore together. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and remember, we're all just trying to survive impossible circumstances the best way we know how. Sometimes we make the right choices, sometimes we don't. But our stories matter, our struggles matter, and understanding the past helps us navigate the present. Good night, everyone. I'll see you in the next story.